Today, the regulation of duck quacking, buy now, pay later loans. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news. Well, as I said recently, the buy now, pay later situation is simply this. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. In other words, anything that you get using buy now, pay later is a credit product. And finally, the government has come clean on this, even if the legislation as proposed now is still relatively weak. In fact, Australia has now joined the UK in regulating the buy now, pay later industry under significant changes announced by the Financial Services Minister on Monday. Financial Services Minister Stephen Jones told a borrowing and lending conference in Sydney that buy now, pay later looks like credit, it acts like credit, it carries the risk of credit, and therefore the services would be regulated as credit products. Now, of course, buy now, pay later has been around for a few years, and essentially what you do is you pay for something in installments, but you can take it away straight away. Now, it was initially bought to buy fairly stock standard items, including like clothing and technology products, but it's increasingly being used to pay for groceries, medical bills, vet bills, and even power bills. It can be a convenient option to pay off an item you want right now, and the companies don't ask questions about whether you can afford to meet the repayments, which can be where some customers come unstuck. If you're able to meet your repayment schedule, you won't have to pay any interest, but if you do miss a deduction, you'll incur a late payment charge, which varies depending on the provider, and the missed payments can also add up very quickly, especially if you have multiple purchases and repayments to meet. And in fact, in my surveys, what I see is that those under financial difficulty end up with multiple buy now, pay later accounts, and of course, they get themselves into a terrible tangle. And it's worth remembering, of course, that those late repayments can also appear on your credit report, which affects your ability to borrow money in the future, meaning it can be harder for you to get a mortgage or a loan or a new car. In short, the government is going to change the law to classify buy now, pay later products as credit products, which means that they will be subjected to tougher regulations. Until now, the services have been largely unregulated, with a Treasury paper released last year finding the services followed unaffordable or inappropriate lending practices and contributed to financial harm. Millions of Australians have accounts with buy now, pay later services, with the majority aged between 18 and 35. And it's worth noting that regulation of the sector has been on the table for months, with the government considering three possible options. One, strengthening the current self-regulated industry code but adding an affordability test. Secondly, introducing limited regulation of the industry under the Credit Act. Or thirdly, regulating the industry entirely under the Credit Act, meaning they would face the same laws as credit card providers. And it's worth noting as a sidebar that, of course, buy now, pay later players who have quite different models typically argued that they weren't actually increasing access to credit, they were just making it more available. In other words, there were existing credit cards with existing limits that were now being used, except of course some were now using debit cards instead. Now the federal government selected option 2, meaning buy now, pay later services will be considered credit products and will need to meet certain elements of the Credit Act, which includes complying with responsible lending obligations and holding Australian credit licenses. And buy now, pay later providers will also have to meet statutory dispute resolution and hardship requirements, complying with product disclosure obligations, and follow existing restrictions on marketing their products. As the Financial Services Minister Stephen Jones put it in a speech to the Responsible Lending and Borrowing Summit in Sydney on Monday, it boils down to the fact that the industry has been unchecked and unregulated and the products have been causing serious harm. Back in 2020, a report by ASIC, the corporate watchdog, found that some consumers were suffering harm as a result of the buy now, pay later schemes. The report noted that 19% of customers had been cutting back on essentials or going without them altogether, or 1 in 5 consumers were missing payments, with some taking out additional loans to make up the shortfall. Evidence suggests these risks are disproportionately affecting women, First Nations communities, and people on low incomes, Mr. Jones said on Monday. We have heard people are opening multiple buy now, pay later accounts to access far more debt than they would be able to get on a credit card or payday loan. And we've also heard that some people have been weaponising buy now, pay later products in abusive relationships. Mr. Jones said the government-initiated review of the industry also followed significant concerns about the dispute resolution and hardship processes and excessive fees and problematic marketing processes. Ultimately, the government says the changes are about protecting consumers while also ensuring the stability of the buy now, pay later industry. So, there's a few things to note. That if you are a user of buy now, pay later services, there will be some changes. Firstly, suitability and affordability checks will be put in place. That means for customers, you will be assessed on whether buy now, pay later services are suitable for your needs and you are able to afford the repayments like any other loan. And the regulation will also mean that buy now, pay later providers won't be allowed to raise spending limits without permission. The changes will also mean better protection for consumers if things go wrong. There will be hardship provisions and better complaints processes, as well as caps on fees charged for missed and late payments. Essentially, going forward, it won't be as easy to use buy now, pay later services as it currently is, without some further checks and balances to ultimately protect consumers. Now, the largest buy now, pay later player, Afterpay, welcomed the changes put forward by the federal government. The announcement from the government is a strong first step in the development of a fit-for-purpose buy now, pay later regulatory framework that embeds effective consumer protection, generates positive outcomes for consumers and businesses, and provides certainty for industry. An Afterpay spokesperson said, "We look forward to working with the government, consumer groups and other stakeholders to get the details right in the coming months, and to build on the many consumer protections we're already providing, and to set high industry standards across the board for all providers of buy now, pay later services." And Zip co-founder Peter Gray also praised the changes, saying it balances the needs of consumers and the industry. "We do really believe that option 2 is a sensible balance between protecting consumers from harms, delivering confidence to industry stakeholders, but also promoting competition and innovation," Gray said. But whilst consumer groups were also broadly supportive, there were some concerns that there will be some loopholes. Fiona Guthrie, the Chief Executive of Financial Counselling Australia, wants assurances that the modified lending obligations will prevent people from taking out loans bigger than they can afford. The biggest concern that financial counsellors have is that the modified responsible lending obligations won't go far enough. And so the core problem with this product is people getting in over their heads. She said, "We're really worried that the legislation may not address that problem." And Guthrie said she wants to see more details to understand how consumers will be protected, including whether buy now, pay later providers will be part of the credit reporting system. If they're not part of the credit reporting system, then the problem with multiple accounts will continue, she said. On average, our clients have 3 accounts, but we see some people with 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8 accounts and huge amounts of debt. The Treasury says it's going to work closely with the buy now, pay later industry and consumer groups, and will iron out further details about how the regulation will work in the coming months. And it's expected exposure draft legislation will be released for consultation later this year, and the bill will be introduced to Parliament before the end of the year, and Mr. Jones expects the legislation will be enforced by the end of 2023. Now, 2 points. Firstly, I welcome this move. It's definitely in the right direction. And you can see here how the government has compromised on both sides of the fence. Consumers are not fully protected, and the industry is now being pulled into some sort of shape. And at least there's a recognition now that buy now, pay later is actually a credit product, which means, of course, that it should be taken into account when anybody applies for any type of loan, because it's part of the repayment profile of that individual. The second question, which is the critical one, is will it be connected back to the credit scoring system, where, of course, the idea is that all exposures and payments are actually being reported so that when you apply for a credit product, your current status is fully understood. That's critical, because otherwise this will be a bit pointless. But thirdly, of course, the question we've got to ask is, what about all those people who've had these loans and other facilities for some time, and particularly under the current pressure with regard to cost of living and rising mortgage rates, more people have been turning to buy now, pay later just to get by. So it could be that we're going to be throttling this industry just at the point when, of course, people are already in financial difficulty. Or in other words, a lot of buy now, pay later water has already gone under the bridge, and those ducks are still quacking like mad. So this is a good step forward. More needs to be done. And personally, I think that we should have moved to really look at buy now, pay later as another credit product, and therefore option 3 would have been a better solution. But then, of course, the industry would have grizzled, and we know that this government also doesn't want to upset industry too much. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.